Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, this episode is brought to you by our sponsor, Wondrium, Wondrium. Wondrium is the former Great Courses teaching company, and they've not only cataloged all their courses, they've adopted many more companies to include their content online, which you can get through your app, and you just touch it on the phone and you open it up and it looks something like this. And oh, look at this. Since it's the Christmas season, here is the Triumph of Christianity. This is by none other than Bart Ehrman, who I recently had on the show. And his course is 24 lectures on the triumph of Christianity. From Jesus of Nazareth to the Holy Roman Empire, explore the rise of Christianity. Each lecture looks to be about 25 to 30 minutes, which you can get through in about 20 minutes at 1.2 speed. They can listen to them on audio or video. And I usually listen to these while I'm out cycling or hiking with my dog or doing chores, driving around in traffic and so forth. So here's the deal. If you subscribe through this podcast, you get a free 1-month trial. You just sign up for a free 1-month trial. You don't have to pay anything, and you can cancel if you decide you don't want it. Although, why would you? Because it's great. At wondrium.com/Shermer, wondrium.com/SHERMER. Shermer, that's me. And give it a try. And this is just one of many courses. You can just kind of scroll down and you see all the different kinds of offerings they have here. And the beauty of this particular system is you can skip around. If you decide you don't like a course or you're bored with the lecture, go to the next lecture or go to the next course or whatever you choose to do. So, here's a new one. Just came up. New course, Norse mythology. Think you know Norse mythology from comic books, operas, film, and television? No, I don't, but uncover startling truths about old Norse myth, sagas, gods, heroes, and monsters. Ooh, my gosh. Okay, I'm going to check this one out for sure. This one is 24 lectures, also about 30 minutes each. And okay, so anyway, that's the idea. Again, go to wondrium.com/Shermer for your free 1-month trial. Give it a try, and that does support the podcast. Thanks for listening. Here's our next guest. My guest today is David Wengrow. He is the co-author of the new book, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. David Graeber, his co-author, was a professor of anthropology at the London School of Economics. He's the author of Debt, The First 5,000 Years, and Bullshit Jobs, A Theory, and was a contributor to Harper's Magazine, The Guardian, and The Baffler. An iconic thinker and renowned activist, his early efforts in Zuccotti Park made Occupy Wall Street an era-defining movement. He died on September 2nd, 2020. David Wengrow, who I speak to today, is a professor of comparative archaeology at the Institute of Archaeology, University College London, and has been a visiting professor at New York University. He's the author of several books, including What Makes Civilization? Wengrow conducts archaeological fieldwork in various parts of Africa and the Middle East. Okay, this book is challenging the mainstream dogma about the history of civilization, moving from small bands and tribes to larger chiefdoms and states, and from egalitarian horizontal structures of governance to hierarchical structures of governance. And they challenge that. They're claiming that the archaeological evidence shows that this is not necessarily inevitable. Of course, it has happened many times, but they claim that it's also happened many times that large-scale societies, state-level societies, were not necessarily hierarchical, and that those horizontal structures are far more peaceful, egalitarian, and can still somehow manage to resolve conflict and make sure everybody in the population gets along without too much crime and free riding and all the other problems that comes with increasing the size of the population of a society that we've traditionally thought about. So you be the judge. I push him on this point because it's pretty well established how civilization has developed. And they claim that that is all nonsense, that we've been sort of hoodwinked, as it were, or blinded or stuck in a box or whatever metaphor you want to use in that the evidence is quite clear that there are many, many ways for societies to be structured, large-scale societies, and that there's historically been lots of experiments that have been run. So I recommend the book. I don't agree with all of it, but that's okay. I think it's a game changer in terms of the conversation about history of civilization. So give this conversation a close review and let me know what you think about it. And if you support the podcast, please go to skeptic.com/donate, and you can support podcast there through the Skeptic Society, which is a 501c3 nonprofit. So your donation there is tax deductible. And that is the umbrella organization that produces Skeptic Magazine and the podcast and my Substack column and so forth. So thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. The UCLA geographer Jared Diamond has calculated from his studies of the hunter-gatherer peoples of Papua New Guinea, a small band of 20 people generates 190 possible dyads, or two-person interactions, 20 times 19 divided by 2. Small enough for informal conflict resolution, but increase that 20 to 2,000 and you're facing 1,999,000 possible dyads, 2,000 times 1999 divided by 2. Here, a 100-fold population increase produces a 10,000-fold dyadic rise. Scale that up to cities of 200,000 or 2 million, and the potential for conflict multiplies beyond comprehension, along with its laws and regulations needed to ensure relative harmony and efficiency. So here's how Diamond describes it in his book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, and then this will launch us into your book. Quote, once the threshold of several hundred, below which everyone can know everyone else, has been crossed, increasing numbers of dyads become pairs of unrelated strangers. Hence, a large society that continues to leave conflict resolution to all of its members is guaranteed to blow up. That factor alone would explain why societies of thousands can exist only if they develop centralized authority to monopolize force and resolve conflict. So if I was going to pick a thesis that your book is writing against, it would be that, correct?
Yeah, it's a good one. Do you agree with a single word of what you just read?
I do, actually. Yes, quite a bit. I think, at least in the modern world, we see what happens when, say, cities become lawless, or law and order breaks down, or the police go on strike. There's rioting and looting, and people become more lawless. I do think we need some kind of governance of some sort, whatever you want to call it. I don't know if it has to be hierarchical, but it seems like people are rational actors and making, sort of rational utility choices from an economic perspective. And so if you say, if you give them the incentive to cheat or steal, they will. Not everybody, but enough people. So the shadow of enforcement is important, however that's done.
Okay, but you've slightly shifted the goalposts there, if you don't mind me saying so. You're talking about the breakdown of an existing system. Mr. Diamond is talking about the construction of systems.
You mean how it began in the first place?
Right, and what were the possibilities? Of course, you could begin with his assumption, in which case something like our present system was completely inevitable, and then you could hypothesize about what happens when it breaks down, or you could talk about what does in fact happen when it breaks down now. But then you're into a completely circular argument.
Okay, so this does bring us into your book, because we're now reaching back into the mists of history where we don't have a lot of information. In pre-writing, there's just...
but we do. I'm sorry, I have to stop you there, Michael. I'm an archaeologist, and I work in an institute with about 100 colleagues who would fervently disagree with you.
Oh, please, okay.
We have an absolutely enormous amount of information about the past.
No, I mean...
far more than human beings have had at any point in our history.
Yes, nice. Okay. So just give us a walkthrough. Take up a place like Göbekli Tepe, which I'm fascinated by. How can you infer from the stones and tools and whatnot, what kind of social, hierarchical, or egalitarian, or whatever structure they had from that stuff?
Well, we're talking with Göbekli Tepe about one of a number of sites. It's not isolated, actually. We think that there were at least 10, possibly more, such monumental centers in that particular area. It's a part of the world called the Urfa Valley, near the modern border between Syria and Turkey. And when I say monumental, I'm not exaggerating. We're talking about huge stone buildings with great sculpted images on them and freestanding stone sculptures, architecture that would have weighed tons. So one thing we can infer straight away is that we're not talking about Jared Diamond's Papua New Guinea small egalitarian groups of hunter-gatherers, because it would be inconceivable for a society of such small scale to create such enormous monuments. But we are talking about hunter-gatherers, because these are people whose economy has been investigated in detail using the latest archaeological scientific techniques, and there's no evidence that they had domesticated crops or that they were keeping domestic animals. So there you have two inferences, which according to Diamond and according to traditional wisdom should be wrong. Hunter-gatherers should not be doing this kind of thing. But here we have some very solid archaeological evidence that indeed they were.
Right. Yes, exactly. So, my interpretation of this is that we underestimated hunter-gatherers. They are obviously quite capable of doing much more than we thought. So it's sort of a bigotry of low expectations imposed on the past.
That's a nice way to put it.
Yeah. Yeah.
The best example of bigotry of low, I really like that. It reminds me of the names that archaeologists gave to some of these hunter-gatherer cultures when we knew less about them. In North America, for example, the whole period of civilization before the introduction of crops is technically known as the archaic period. So that tells you straight away that nobody was expecting a great deal from it. Actually, again, in that part of the world, we know today that actually there was a huge amount going on, including the construction of centers that are even more monumental than Göbekli Tepe.
Maybe move the mic a little bit closer or speak a little bit louder, because it's just a little soft there. So my intersection with this, just through my little world of skeptic and dealing with like alternative archaeologists, who I know you're familiar with, like a great.
Oh, really? You're interested in that?
Oh yeah. So I publish.
I didn't know.
Skeptic magazine, and we deal with claims of the paranormal and pseudoscience. And let me see if I have one here on alternative.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah. So alternative archaeology has been one of our areas, like who really discovered the Americas, or, the claimed voyages from Africa to South America, because the Olmec statues have African features to them, that kind of thing. So I once spent almost 4 hours on Joe Rogan's podcast with Graham Hancock, who writes these books about how stuff just keeps getting older. I'm sure you know of Graham's work, and he's a pretty interesting guy. He's very smart. He's a good writer. He's been to Göbekli Tepe, and so he has quite a bit on this, which I was fascinated by. Now, to me, he's not an ancient aliens kind of guy. He's just saying that there were people living before, say, 20,000 years ago, maybe even 30,000 years ago, that were building these kinds of things, and they had a kind of wisdom to them, that they were capable of doing things like Göbekli Tepe that you guys, not you particularly, but mainstream archaeologists have always said can't be done. So his theme is, stuff just keeps getting older, by which he means sophisticated social systems and peopling and civilizations keep getting older and older, and therefore we need to overturn this kind of dogma that we've been stuck with, which in a way you're doing, but not to the extent that he does. So the Göbekli Tepe thing,
the chronology sounds, I mean, it sounds for his argument. I confess I haven't read any of his books since I was a teenager. I think I read one when I was about 15 about the hunt for the Holy Grail, which he claimed to have found in Ethiopia. It was very entertaining. I enjoyed it. But that was when I was 15. I mean, it sounds like for an argument like the one that you say he's making, chronology is going to be of the utmost importance. So we need to get those dates right. Göbekli Tepe is approximately 10,000 years old, maybe slightly more, perhaps 11, maximum 12,000 years old, but it's nothing like the dates you mentioned.
Yes, no, he's not claiming it's that old. He's claiming that there were peoples living before Göbekli Tepe, or else how would the people that built Göbekli Tepe know how to do it? So there's kind of a cultural tradition.
And what's the well, people like you and I, roughly, cognitively, physically, have been around on the planet, we think, for at least 200,000 years. 200,000,
Right,
not 20,000.
Right. Right. So the question,
There's no question.
what's the oldest? Is Göbekli Tepe the oldest thing we have that's something like a monumental architecture that would have required fairly extensive social organization and cooperation to build?
No. There are structures, for example, in Europe, various parts of Europe, all the way from Poland in the east over to France and Spain in the west, that potentially could qualify for the description you've just given. In the eastern part of Europe, you have, going back to the Ice Age, what most experts have defined as public buildings. They go back something more like 20 or 25,000 years, so the last glacial maximum period. And they're wonderful constructions. They're actually built out of the bones and the tusks of woolly mammoth. And these are organized into elaborate patterns. And I haven't actually visited one of these sites myself. There's one, I think, in Krakow in Poland, actually, in the urban area. But they've been widely investigated, and I've talked to prehistorians who have worked on them. And some of these structures are really pretty enormous. And the amounts of meat that would have been taken off these animals once they'd been skinned and butchered, in order to give you all of that raw material, all the bones and the tusks and so on. These are definitely not everyday dwellings. They're some kind of special structures. Maybe some people actually don't think they were lived in at all. The latest theory I read, which looks like it's based on very rigorous evidence, suggests that they were more like monuments, in the sense that people would construct them and then cover them with earth, so that you ended up with a permanent kind of landscape monument, perhaps marking the occasion of a hunt, because we're talking about animals that seasonally migrated through these Ice Age landscapes, through the tundra, and then presumably you have a season of abundance linked to the hunt, and the mammoth building would be a kind of lasting monument, is what they suggested. This was a group of, it was a mixture of European, some Russian, some non-Russian scholars. So as far as I'm aware, those are the earliest really large-scale architectural things that we have.
And what are the dates on those?
As I was saying, those go back to about 20 to 25,000 years ago. Some of them are more recent.
Right. Another one of my areas of interest is the origins and purpose of religion. And so you'll often see, if you Google Göbekli Tepe, this was the first ceremonial, religious, spiritual, or whatever. But again, how do you interpret what these things mean? I mean, there's those huge T-shaped pillars with the animals in bas relief. So they had to carve the stone around to leave the animal figure protruding from the back stone. And that's remarkable. It's incredible. But I don't know how you get spirituality. I don't know how you interpret that.
I was a graduate student when that site first started coming to everybody's attention. German archaeologists had been working there since the 1980s under the direction of an archaeologist called Klaus Schmidt. And Turkish archaeologists had known about it for just as long, at least. But it really started coming to people's attention in the 1990s, and I have to say it was a shock. Nobody was expecting anything of that kind of scale in that part of the world at such an early date. And the art, the imagery, which I actually studied as part of my own PhD thesis at the University of Oxford, is very intriguing. It's kind of nightmarish is the best word I can use for it. These figures of wild animals, poisonous animals, in strange profiles. Often the teeth are very prominent, and often the sex is marked. They have male genitalia. It's interesting, there's emphasis on masculinity. there are actually very few images that look like imaginary creatures. There's something I didn't realize at the time, only strikes you later on, look like what we would call monsters or, imaginary beings, where you take a bit. I actually wrote a whole book about this called The Origins of Monsters, which is about images and human cognition. And it struck me that actually, although these figures are very strange and a bit alarming, they don't actually play very much on the possibilities of composite figuration. It's only much later, around the time that cities emerge, that you get people just doing something as simple as taking the wings of a bird and sticking them on a quadruped, to create some sort of composite creature. It's surprisingly rare in prehistoric art, including at Göbekli Tepe. But I'm digressing into monsters, which is
Well, no,
another
that's
book
all
I
right,
wrote.
because so that gives me another question. When you're looking at these things, how do you get around the idea, like, if I made this, this is what I would have been thinking? Because you can't do that because we don't know what they were thinking. But you got to think something. You have to try to explain it somehow.
Well, it's very important for archaeologists to train in anthropology, because if you take an interest in the art of non-Western civilizations, including non-literate civilizations, or what used to be rather condescendingly referred to as as primitive art, you realize that images and image systems throughout human history have played much more complex roles than we actually tend to give them today. We tend to think of images as illustrations to a story, or things that illustrate a proposal that you might make in the form of language. If you look at the role of images in, for example, indigenous Amazonian societies, or the societies of Melanesia, or tattooing traditions in Polynesia, you see something much more sophisticated and much more complex, where images can play cognitive roles that we ascribe to writing. They can be forms of contract. In Australian Aboriginal art, for example, images often encode land rights and systems of inheritance. People have found ways to use images as really important intellectual devices. And this is critical, I think, in debunking some of these rather odd claims that are made about how people thought about the world before writing. We tend to think of the invention of writing as this great cognitive revolution that enabled people to store information and make complex decisions on a large scale, the way that Jared Diamond was worrying about, as his dyads keep multiplying and oh, how are we going to keep track of all the information? As if, before writing, all people had was their two hands and what's between their ears. No. What we see, as far back as the evidence can take us, so very often people are using images and image systems to carry all sorts of information about navigation, topography, the passage of time, the movement of the stars. And this is information that is shared between people. It's social information. So images, you realize as an archaeologist, it's not enough to sit there thinking, what would I have meant if I'd made that picture? You have to immerse yourself in the range of possibilities. One of my former colleagues at the University of London, Peter Ucker, was a great advocate of this. You would look at an image, the prehistoric art from Egypt or something that somebody had called a mother goddess, because it's an image of like people talk about the famous Venus figurines from Ice Age Europe. It's an image of a corpulent woman, and people begin to speculate that it may have been a this or a that. And he would just systematically demonstrate, using examples from non-Western cultures, all the different possibilities of what this thing could be, so that by the time he'd finished, you didn't really feel safe saying anything at all, which is a way of casting doubt on our supposed objectivity, but it also it constrains your speculations.
Right, and of course, we all have a Western bias. It's hard to get out of that. So, because I remember reading about cave paintings that initial interpretations were sympathetic magic until somebody pointed out the animals that they were painting were not the ones they were hunting. So it couldn't have been that kind of sympathetic magic. And then where do you go from there?
That's a very interesting debate, which actually Akko was deeply involved in. He co-authored the classic book in the 1960s with Andre Rosenfeld on Paleolithic cave art, where they went into exactly those kind of functional explanations, and they concluded that at least for the rock art of Western Europe, there's no single explanation that can account for 20,000 years of image making. That's a lot of human history. One of the intriguing things about those, though, is that they very rarely depict humans. And when they do, they look very different from those sophisticated, very realistic depictions of animals. The human depictions are often much more rudimentary, which is fascinating, and I'm not sure I've ever heard a particularly good explanation for it.
Yeah, I live in Santa Barbara here. We have Chumash art on the rocks around here on hikes. I have some on my own property. Right. Or just at the bottom of my property. Yeah. And it's fun to kind of stare at them and just kind of put yourself back into time and think, what were they thinking? What does this mean? And I really have no idea. I mean, this isn't my field, but I try not to, overinterpret what I would be thinking. And, this is another one of those great debates, the peopling of the Americas, the ages keep getting older and older. And again, someone like Graham Hancock and other.
Did you see those discoveries at White Sands in New Mexico?
Yes, right. What is it, 19,000 or 26,000 or something? It was like 7,000 years older.
Yeah, they certainly push back what most prehistorians have seen as the earliest evidence. They push it back by some considerable thousands of years.
Yeah.
These footprints.
Yeah, the key there though is that
I think this is also isn't that also the place where they did the atomic experiments?
Yeah, White Sands
there,
is
right?
where the first nuclear weapon, atomic bomb, was detonated. Yes,
it's like something from a David. It's like something from a David Lynch movie, right? You've got the beginning and the end.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the reason that was of interest is because the so-called ice corridor that was supposed to be opened up for people to walk from Siberia, Alaska, all the way down to North America and South America and so on. It was closed at that time when these footprints, they didn't walk down the glaciers. So I think, what do I know? But I think they came down the coast. I think they took boats. I mean, who would want to hike? Hiking is slow, and you just throw it in a boat and come down the coast.
Think about it. Who would choose to walk through a glacial landscape?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very strange theory. Which I read a very funny comment. Actually, I think it's in the ancient Cambridge History of North America, which Bruce Trigger edited, where one of the contributors showed a map of what was then 20, 30 years ago thought to be the route over the land bridge of Beringia into North America, the land route you've described, cutting through the glaciers, and showed it to I forget which First Nation, maybe it was a Cherokee guy or something. They showed him this map. And he looked at it and just went, well, some people might have come that way, but we certainly didn't. I mean,
right.
Who would?
If you went that way, you went the hard way.
The latest archaeological evidence that I'm aware of started building up about 20 or 30 years ago, actually with investigations in the southern part, South America and Peruvian coast, where they started finding sites going back to at least 15,000 years ago or earlier. And that came to be known as the Kelp Highway hypothesis, which is that, in fact, exactly as you say, it was a largely coastal, not exclusively, but largely coastal migration from north to south around the Pacific, which I think makes a great deal of sense.
Totally. I mean, the food is great. It's plentiful right on the coast there. And
This touches on a joke that we made in the book, because coastal environments are so much nicer in many ways,
totally. That's
for
why I live here.
hunter-gatherers. Um, right.
But the
And
problem
that's
is
right.
that,
Chumash certainly were.
yeah, the time we're talking about, though, the sea levels would have been several hundred feet lower than they are now. So whatever coastal sites they might have stopped at and left their trash and tools and whatnot is underwater. And I don't know the state of underwater archaeology, but I presume it's pretty difficult.
It's getting a lot better, and we're actually starting to get some really remarkable information, not just in the US and Canada, but also in Scandinavia, for example. Some of these submerged sites, we are able to investigate them now. Actually, the material that's been coming out of British Columbia in the vicinity of Vancouver is really astonishing. They've got really massive coastal fortifications and sites going back, I think, to the beginning of the Holocene, so, back 10, 12,000 years or so, on a scale that nobody was expecting. But you're quite right. I mean, we've lost great swathes of coastal land and a lot of archaeology in the process.
Yeah, this brings up this kind of philosophy of science and who has the burden of proof. The Clovis first hypothesis appears to be debunked. Okay. But the moment you debunk that, how far back are you allowed to go before you're now on the fringes of science and now the burden of proof is on you to make your case?
There is an important new book which I confess I haven't had time to read yet. It's at the top of my pile by an archaeologist called Paulette Steeves about the Paleolithic colonization of the Americas. And as I say, I haven't read it yet and I can't comment, but it's clearly an important intervention into this whole debate, just to mention.
Yeah, well, on that podcast with Graham Hancock on Joe Rogan's podcast, he that week there was a paper published in Nature about a find in the San Diego area here in Southern California of a mammoth tooth and some mammoth bones that had been broken in a way that looks like they were butchered by humans. But the problem is that the data was 130,000 years old. So there were no people here 130,000 years ago. I mean, not even close. But of course, for Graham, it's like, you see, stuff keeps getting older. It keeps going back and back. But then there was a subsequent paper published that said, well, maybe those bones were broken by the construction workers in their big, huge trucks that were rolling over that dirt as I think they were excavating it for a highway or a bridge or something like that. And so there.
Well, this is the science of archaeology. I mean, you're talking there what we teach our students about taphonomic processes, which is absolutely fundamental, and it's why things go a bit wrong sometimes when people who aren't trained in archaeology look at this stuff and start trying to build a picture of what was going on. I don't mean that to sound patronizing, but it does take years to begin to understand what we mean by taphonomic processes, which is all the various factors from, indeed, a bulldozer going over the land surface to geological motion, to fluvial motion of rivers, all the many, many things that affect the survival of an archaeological site, apart from what the people were originally doing there. Before we even get to the question of what the people were thinking and what they were doing, we have all these other taphonomic factors that need to be incorporated. And this is a challenge when you come to write a book like the one I wrote with David Graeber, The Dawn of Everything, where you don't want to inflict, if you start going into that level of detail on a world scale, when you're talking about the history on that kind of scope, the book would never end, and the reader would probably be fast asleep by the time you got to the third footnote. So it's about striking a balance, I guess, between dissenting voices of experts within the academy, because there's very rarely full agreement about anything, and very complex bodies of data, and trying to distill that and give the reader enough transparency so that they can go and check the facts if they want to. That's why we have a very long bibliography in the book and lots of notes. We want to give the reader that freedom to chase up these ideas and see where they come from. I mean, we're drawing here on thousands of researchers' work. over the years. But it is a balancing act.
Right. So the accepted paradigm is this shift from bands and tribes to chiefdoms and states, from more egalitarian, horizontal social structures to more hierarchical ones. And so the burden of proof is on you to challenge that. And so this is what you've done. This is why you have a massive book. And you make a pretty good case, I think, for a diversity of governance structures. And so that brings us back to, let's say, Göbekli Tepe again. All right, what is your explanation for what they were doing there? It doesn't appear that they lived there, but how do you get, 1,000 people or whatever it would take to move those 15-ton stones to do that in some way that, everybody participates equally, and the guy that hangs back and doesn't do his share, what do we do with him, and that kind of thing?
Well, there's two strands of evidence that we draw attention to in the book, which come not out of the monuments themselves so much, but the teeny tiny micro level remains associated with them. One of the really intriguing things about these circular structures, where the monoliths are located in the walls and in the center, is that at least according to Schmidt and the first generation of archaeologists who worked there, they were built, and then probably not that long afterwards, they were just filled in with junk. They found huge amounts of animal bone remains, as if somebody had had a great feast, and then just closed the whole thing down. What I hear from my colleagues who are still working there is that they're now testing this hypothesis. They're not quite so sure. That's in the nature of archaeological discovery. Hypotheses get refined and questioned. But the analysis of those remains, the detail of the animal bone and tooth, shows that this site was located in a place where you would have had annual, or perhaps twice a year, migrations of gazelle, huge numbers of gazelle. Imagine it sweeping down through the Urfa Valley. So this was a place where you could intercept. A bit like those mammoth hunters we were talking about before in the last ice age. And there's also been a very thorough analysis of the wild plant remains. It's sometimes confusing. People see reports, particularly once scientific reports get into the mainstream media, and they say, oh, we found cereals at Göbekli Tepe. So people think they were agriculturalists, but these are wild cereals, wild wheat. They're the ancestors of our domestic ones, but they weren't actually domestic. Anyway, there's a new book just out by a German prehistorian called Laura Dietrich, which goes into enormous detail about these. And they found lots of these stone grinding tools for processing wild plant foods. You see, this is the detail that matters. Once you get past the stunning images and the shocking monoliths, archaeologists have all this other information. And it looks like these were what we might call seasonal agglomeration sites, where people came together in very large numbers. It doesn't mean there weren't some people living there all year round. Actually, there's pretty good evidence that there was. But at certain times of year, when you had an abundance of wild resources, those numbers would multiply. And one thing we go into in the book is a very rich body of evidence for what that means. When a society morphs, it changes its form, its demographic form. This goes right back to where you started with Jared Diamond. I mean, that picture he paints of human social evolution, and it starts with a figure. Here's this number of people. And then, oh, look, if it multiplies, we've got this number of people. And, it's all a bit, it's a little bit silly, because we know that humans live in groups, they live in societies. And what we're talking about with Göbekli Tepe and many other hunter-gatherer societies are actually groups that changed their form and their demographic density, often with the seasons. So you would have times of abundance when people come together in great numbers, do extraordinary things, build monuments, whatever it may be, and then split off and form very different kinds of societies. It's a well-known phenomenon in anthropology, and it's fascinating because the contrasts between the different seasonal variations can be very striking. you may be talking at one point about a matriarchal society that flips to patriarchal, or a society that has private property rules and then abandons them.
In the course of just changing seasons or in a single year.
Oh, yeah. In the course of changing seasons, there are fascinating examples from North America. Excuse me.
It's all right.
It's that season. It's the cold season.
Yeah.
One of our favorites. Mm-hmm. Sorry, go ahead.
While you're doing that, I was just going to say, so, back to kind of how science works, we want to put a map, a cognitive map on some complex system. So the idea of stages is very appealing. You can reduce a lot of complexity and diversity into a simpler model, which can be oversimplified. So that's one problem. But on the other hand, you want some kind of theory. What happens when you hit this particular population density? Oh, well, it then flips from tribes to chiefdoms to states and so on. Your whole point is that that's just too simple. It reminds me of like Freudian stages or Kubler-Ross's stages of death and dying. None of these hold up because people don't go marching through these stages. They just don't. But it's a way of thinking about it or talking about it or trying to wrap our minds around this.
I mean, the way I was... That's right. And I think one of the reasons why that simple model is still talked about is because it was kind of elegant. It's easy to remember. Bands, tribes, chiefdoms, states, we can all get our heads around that. And although archaeologists and anthropologists have been critiquing that model blind for generations now, people still remember it because what we haven't done is put something equally elegant in its place. And we're trying to do a little bit of that work in the book, or at least start a conversation about what those new categories might look like. But it's a bit like... I was describing to someone in a French magazine I talked to earlier today. With the existing model, it's a bit like a magician with a magic box or something, trying to fit everything in the box, and it keeps jumping out. It doesn't fit. Hunter-gatherers are not doing what we thought they're supposed to be doing. We look at early agricultural societies, and oh shit, they're not actually behaving the way that we thought. And early cities turn out to be egalitarian just as often as they're hierarchical. So they keep trying to shove it all back in the box, and these little critters just keep jumping out. They won't fit anymore. So at some point, you got to throw the box away and look at this new picture which is emerging from the evidence.
Yeah, but you're still looking for causal vectors there. So, for example, why would it shift from egalitarian to hierarchical in the spring or winter or whenever this supposedly happens?
That's very interesting because actually one thing we noticed is that there's no universal pattern. Sometimes it's the smaller groups, the seasonally smaller groups are more hierarchical. For example, the circumpolar peoples described by anthropologists in the 19th and early 20th century, they would have very large winter houses built of whale bones and whale ribs. These were big communal buildings. Obviously, they got very long winters. And during that long winter season, there was no private property. Actually, it was very communalistic. People would have to share everything, even sexual partners. There was no patriarchy, and there was very little hierarchy at all. And then they would split off in the summer months into small kinship groups, little nuclear families to go off to the coast and hunt walrus and fish. And those would actually be very authoritarian, particularly the fathers could boss their sons around and their wives. And so it's actually the opposite of what we tend to think, which is that the smaller group is more egalitarian and the larger group it's the other way around. But we have other examples, like in the book we talk about the Nambiquara, who are Brazilian Amazonian society. With them, it's the other way around. When they congregate into the larger villages to practice cultivation, things are actually not particularly egalitarian. So there's no uniform sort of pattern to it. It's not as if small means equal and large means hierarchical. Sometimes it's the other way around.
But if you have, say, a communal, more egalitarian social structure, even if it's for just a few months, how do you deal with people that don't pull their weight? So Christopher Bohm talks about this in his the moral origins. We call these groups egalitarian, but they're not really. Or to make them egalitarian, you have to have a whole social system in place to deal with free riders and bullies, especially. Maybe 1% to 3% of the human populations are psychopathic, sociopathic. They just don't play nice by the rules. They don't want to participate. So you got to deal with them. Now we have a whole other argument about, well, why can evolution just eliminate all the psychopaths? Well, that takes too much energy, and most groups can tolerate a few percentage and deal with them as best we can. And there's always going to be a little bit of free riding. But his point is that even though they don't have a hierarchical government structure with a court system and police and so on, they have a whole system in place of punishment, shunning and gossip, shunning, punishment, and worst comes to worst, capital punishment. They just, the bully asshole, they just take him on a hunting expedition and they come back without him, and that's how they deal with it.
Which group are we talking about?
I think he was talking about some South American, like, I don't know if it was the Yanomamo, but Christopher Bohm's the hierarchy in the forest, and then the moral origins was the second one.
Hierarchy in the forest. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah,
it's a brilliant book, which we just had one slight problem with it, which is not at all about what you're describing, where he talks about what he calls actuarial intelligence, I think, which is what makes human political behavior so different from the political behavior of other apes, chimps, bonobos, and whatever, is that we have the component of imagination. We can picture what it might be like if you didn't put down the talented hunter or find ways to make fun of the over-assertive bully. We can envisage what might happen to our communities if we didn't do those kind of things. So we come up, as you say, with strategies for keeping people in order. But based on that insight, you would expect human history, all the way back into deep prehistory, to look very colorful and variable. People can imagine all sorts of possibilities. But when Bohm himself gives the big picture of human social evolution, he does something that to our minds was a bit strange, because it seems to go against his own theory. He goes back to that idea that before the invention of agriculture, everyone lived in societies of equals and there were no dominators. Now, why would that be if what makes us distinct, if what makes human politics distinct, is this capacity for imagination? Why did we leave it on the shelf for all those years? And as you can probably infer in our own book, in a way we take Bohm's core theory more seriously than he does, because actually when we look at the archaeological evidence, that's exactly what we see. We see these rich hunter-gatherer burials back in the Ice Age in societies that, as far as we know, were not very hierarchical in other aspects of their lives. In other words, they're constructing one kind of system in a particular area of life, in this case through rituals and funerals, but it doesn't necessarily apply to other parts of their lives. That would be very consistent with what Bohm is talking about. But he himself ignores that kind of evidence, or says it's not terribly important. So we found that a puzzling aspect of an otherwise brilliant and compelling analysis.
Yeah, back to my.
But it doesn't hurt his core theory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, back to my governing Mars problem. The way I kind of ended my essay on that is, I have no idea if this is really the best way we should structure the society of the colonists on Mars, based on what we've done here on Earth. It could be that somebody there will think of some new way that I can't think of. It's not direct democracy. It's not representative democracy. It's something else. Maybe Elon's team of social engineers will invent a new thing, or maybe the Martians will figure something out in a century that you and I just can't even think of.
Well, one of the points we make, think it's in the conclusion of The Dawn of Everything, where we say that we may not be discovering alien civilizations in outer space yet
right here
these days, but we are discovering alien forms of human life in the sense that they don't fit our conventional ways of thinking about human capacities and the capacities of human society. Those we are finding right under our own feet in the history of our planet through archaeology. You don't need to talk about strange races of lizard men. I mean, the actual scientific evidence is fascinating and often bewildering enough. We talk about the Hopewell civilization of Ohio and North America. I mean, that's intriguing, these earthworks,
massive,
which formed
again,
huge
massive
images that could only be really fully seen from the sky.
right.
I mean, that's an extraordinary feat of intelligence and engineering right there. And these things weren't isolated; they formed whole landscapes. There's a study by a very well-respected American archaeologist called John Clark, which shows that they also seem to follow a standard metrical system all the way across the continent. I mean, that's extraordinary.
I just had on the podcast, I haven't
like
released it yet, Fernanda Piri's The Rule of Laws, but 4,000-year history of laws around the world. She has your book on her desk because we were talking about that. She hasn't read it yet, but she's
that looks intriguing. I didn't know about that, but I will check it out. Oh,
yeah, no, it's quite good because she spent time in villages in Nepal, Tibet, Nepal, where they don't have a hierarchical structure, but they do have quite an extensive, like the kind of thing Christopher Baum was talking about, social pressures. Like, because I was asking her, okay, so you got 1,000 people living in the little community here, and there's a conflict. How does it get resolved? Well, we're all going to meet on Wednesday and sit in the big circle and well, what happens if somebody says, well, I'm not going, I'm just going to do my own thing? And then she said, oh boy, there's massive social pressures that if you don't go along with what we've decided, I mean, it's not a court system, it's not a police system and that kind of thing, but there is a system in place because people do that. They don't play nice by the rules.
Well, another problem with the sort of, I mean, we shouldn't blame poor Jared Diamond. He gets blamed for everything. But we shouldn't blame Jared Diamond for everything. I mean, what he's talking about when he talks about human society scaling up and then decision-making becomes more difficult, so you need hierarchical structures to manage all the information flow. He didn't come up with that idea. That's an idea you can find going back to business manuals in the 1960s. Actually, we looked into the origins of this idea there in the social sciences and in social psychology. They used to call it scalar stress theory. Scalar stress, and it's exactly that idea. And can you guess where it actually originates? We chased it back to its origins. It's kind of intriguing.
Military?
It's not in archaeology. It's not in anthropology. You're close. It's in business corporations. Industrial psychology.
This is a little bit like
they sent psychologists.
Robin Dunbar's number of 150, that kind of thing.
Well, Dunbar is a more recent take on this, which has a slightly different origin. He actually started working on the group sizes of non-human apes. And he did some really important work on the correlation between brain size and group size. Actually, brain size is the size of the neocortex. And what he showed are these very interesting correlations between neocortex, brain capacity, and the maximum size of the groups that different primates will form. So bonobos have a certain size brain, they maximize out at a certain number of bonobos. Different number for chimps, it seems to correlate with the brain size. Then he extended it to humans, which in our opinion is where the theory goes rather wrong for interesting reasons that we can discuss. But the scalar stress idea really started with industrial psychologists going into big capitalist corporations and looking at their sort of command structures. So you're already in a hierarchical system. Again, it's a completely circular argument. Like you say, I say, oh my God, the police are on strike, it's chaos. Well, yeah, because you're living in a society where the police guarantee monopoly over the use of violence. Same, you go into a hierarchical business corporation and you study decision-making structures. What do you think you're going to find? A bunch of hippies? No, you're going to find people who are used to taking orders.
Interesting, yeah. But Dunbar's number is based on sort of cognitive capacity to remember the amount of information of how many relationships you can have. So how many people do I have in my Facebook friends group? Well, it's, average 150 or, or the military groups or whatever. Right. Not because it's hierarchical, because just individuals can only keep track of so many friends and relationships.
That's right. That's what I've to be honest, I mean, I know Robin Dunbar slightly. We briefly overlapped at the University of Oxford, and the thing I've never been able to talk to him about, so haven't had an opportunity, but it's the thing that's always puzzled me about his work on the human side, is that it's not necessary to evoke hierarchy and some sort of police state for his theory. There are all kinds of other possibilities, as we show in The Dawn of Everything. There are many different ways that large-scale, dense societies have organized themselves, which don't fit that stratified sort of view. And it's not actually necessary for his theory to limit the possibilities of large-scale human societies to top-down, bureaucratically managed. I mean, it's just historically inaccurate. So, I've never quite understood that aspect. The other difficulty with those kind of scalar models is that they minimize, arguably, what is most distinctive about human social behavior. The best summary of this I've ever come across is by my friend Maurice Bloch, the social anthropologist. He draws a distinction between two basic types of human social behavior. One of them is what you've been talking about, Michael, is that kind of strategic game-playing aspect where, there's always somebody trying to get one over on you. And what do we do with the bully or the cheat, the liar, and that kind of strategic behavior, which is endemic in non-human primates as well. You watch a troop of chimps, they're always trying, who's going to get the mate and who's going to get the nuts. It's that kind of one-upmanship type behavior. What Morris calls the transactional aspect of human society. And Dunbar's theory and some of the other theories you've mentioned and what's his name, Diamond's original formulation, that's what they're about, really, is people making decisions on a rational basis. What's best for me? How does it relate to what's best for her? How do we arrive at some kind of, oh my God, there's too many of us, we can't, let's appoint some leaders and managers and they'll figure it out for us. However, as Morris points out, that simply omits the other 50% of what makes human social behavior human. In other words, what makes it different from your dog that just barked or from other primates. And that is what dogs don't do and what chimps don't do and what even orangutans don't do. It's what Morris calls the transcendental social. And the simplest way to illustrate this, he talked about a village he worked in Madagascar, where there was an old man, one of the village elders, who was a hugely respected guy and was revered as an ancestor of his tribe, his village. And during Morris's field work, he became older, weaker, and a bit doddery, started to lose his faculties, this old chap. And in a chimp or a gorilla or most other sort of animal groups, that would be the end of him. I mean, he would get knocked off his perch and a younger, fitter, more able chimp would jump in and steal his wife and all the rest of it. That's not what happens, of course, because even though he's now very frail and perhaps even incapable of speaking, people still behave towards him with enormous respect. Because he's an elder, he's an ancestor. In other words, this is not transactional behavior. They're no longer behaving towards him based on the evidence of his capacities, which by now show that he's not a powerful man at all. He's a very vulnerable man. They're behaving towards him on the basis of his role in society, which transcends, hence transcendental social, which transcends his physical and mental capacities. And if you think about it, that's an absolutely core component of all human social behavior. I mean, they've traced this back in infants now to very, 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 very early stages of infancy, when the tiny baby can already tell if mummy's not behaving like mummy because they've got some sort of hardwired notion of what that means, which is stable. And these roles are obviously much more stable than just the transactional strategic interactions between people. The president is the president is the president. The queen is the queen is the queen. And we form our societies based to a certain extent on that kind of role playing. People who live and die in their weak flesh and blood bodies step into these transcendental roles, where the rules are already pre-decided. You know, as Karl Marx said, we can make choices, but not always under conditions of our own making. The interesting question is, how is it that humans sometimes have been able to change the rules, actually rewrite the script, throw out some of those transcendental roles, get rid of kings and queens or whatever it may be, and actually reimagine their societies in a different form? And this is a really central point of our book, The Dawn of Everything, is that the human species has been much more creative and much more successful at doing that than our conventional story of human history gives us credit for.
I think everything you described actually is largely reflected in Jared's The World Until Yesterday. He's very praiseworthy in this book of what we've lost in the modern world from these elders. Say, for example, how Papua New Guineans treat their older people, sick people, and so on, and how they resolve conflicts in a non-hierarchical way. He's pretty praiseworthy about that. So, and full disclosure, Jared's a longtime good friend, and whatever he's reflecting in, say, guns,
I've met him actually.
Steel, I think
I had lunch with him once years ago. He came to my university. A colleague of mine invited him, but it happened to be on a day of industrial action, so we couldn't actually get him on campus. And just ended up talking to him off campus in a restaurant or something. It's all fine, and the books we criticize are full of interesting information and full of insights. What we're questioning is the broad sweep, the underlying logic and structure of the arguments they make about the broad sweep of human history. You can have a book which is full of rigorous statistics. There was one
like
some years ago by an ancient historian. Pinker, yes, I've heard of him.
Yes, I know.
Sorry, your picture's a bit pixelated,
it's a bit blurry.
I could only see a sort of
better angels
like
of our nature. Well, I mean, you criticize him for just presenting a lot of anecdotes, like Ötzi the Iceman, but of course that's just chapter 1. The rest of the chapters are packed full of.
It's prehistory. No, I'm told that. There's somebody at the London School of Economics called Jason Hickel who's done a hatchet job on Pinker's statistics in the later parts of the book, and really doesn't feel that they hold up. It's not really my area, to be honest. But even if they do hold up, the argument of the book rests on a modern reading of Thomas Hobbes, right? The 17th century English philosopher. And he's very explicit about that. And that we do know something about, and that is something that we question in The Dawn of Everything, whether a neo-Hobbesian take on the broad sweep of human history really makes any sense in terms of the evidence we have now. And we don't think it does.
You mean of a Leviathan? You need a Leviathan if your population is of a certain size.
The basic argument is that human societies have evolved to be competitive and will use violence to achieve their ends. And, Hobbes famously called it humanity in its state of nature is a war of everyone against everyone. And Pinker uses a rather selective reading of the ethnography of the Yanomamo, who you mentioned earlier, on the border between Venezuela and Brazil. The work of Napoleon Chagnon, which is a rather limited sample. I mean, however you read that ethnography, it's hardly representative of the human condition in general. And in fairness, actually, Chagnon never claimed that it really was. But the basic idea is that they're very violent, and without some kind of central control mechanism, that's how humans are evolved to behave. So the theory basically is about the origins of the state, or the Leviathan, as you say, and as Hobbes called it, which it concentrates all that violence in a center. You have a monopoly of violence you have police, you have military, and that's supposed to somehow suck the violence out of the rest of society, and on aggregate create more peaceful, happier societies than we would otherwise have. Nothing that I've just said, in our opinion, really holds up to any scrutiny. And that's what I mean about the big picture, the broad sweep, being simply wrong.
Yeah, although Steve has other causal vectors in there, for example, the civilizing process, Norbert Elias's idea that people became more civilized just through customs and norms and, changing values and attitudes that come from the bottom up, not the top down from the state. Just how you act toward other people and how you dress and how polite you are.
Blow your nose.
Right, you use tissue rather than your hand. That sort of thing. And Elias, Norbert Elias.
Elias, it's really... One thing I've noticed that's one of my favorite books of all time is The Civilizing Process, Norbert Elias. It's such a brilliant, unusual book. But one thing I've noticed over the years is that only Elias can do Elias. Whenever anyone else tries to use his theory as part of their theory, it all goes terribly wrong.
Why? Really?
Because his theory, I think so. He had this fascinating way of talking about human psychology and human emotion in relation to whole societies and epochs of history. The way he talks about the feudal area, without losing the humanity of it. You can still imagine these vivid, rounded human beings. But when other people try to sort of use that as a theoretical position, all the humanity sort of vanishes, and you end up with this rather rigid model of social evolution, which I don't believe he was really arguing for at all. I think he was talking about very specific institutions, not, it's not like the bands, tribes, chiefdom sort of thing at all. It's much more subtle than that.
Yes, well, Pinker interpreted that to mean Elias's work of kind of self-control of your urges bubbling up from the amygdala, essentially, of urges for violence or sex or whatever, or just being gross, just peeing in the corridor or blowing your nose in your hand. That's or right. Sticking your hand into the meat plate and pulling out a piece of meat and putting it back. We just don't do that. We just don't do that because we're civilized. We're cultured. It's gross. And is that...
Well, one of the limitations when you try to apply that theory on a broader scale is that it's really about a very specific sliver of history in one part of Central and Northern Europe. Not a theory about world history. You can be misled by the title of the book, The Civilizing Process. It sounds like it's meant to be about everything and everyone. Actually, if you're interested in table manners in other civilizations, Claude Lévi-Strauss, the great French anthropologist, wrote volumes and volumes and volumes precisely about the incredibly intricate hierarchies and table manners, but cuisine and all these very, very complex systems of social behavior and manners that you find in non-European societies, including the Amazonian societies where he did his field work. So the idea that having very stringent and complex systems of manners to constrain our behavior, our physical behaviors, is somehow tied to one trajectory of historical development. The European one is really not the case. I mean, there are many. You could look at China, for example. You could tell that story in many different ways, which don't lead to the Enlightenment in its European form, for example. And even the Enlightenment, as we go into in the book, is full of these cross currents, habits, physical habits, smoking tobacco from pipes, sitting around in conversation, drinking caffeinated beverages. Where did we get those habits from? The Americas, the indigenous peoples of the Americas. I don't think you'll find them in Pinker's book, unless I'm mistaken.
Not that
You
particular
may find the
example.
Yanomamo, and you may find examples of violent tribes in deepest, darkest, jungle environments, but you may not find descriptions of how Europeans actually adopted some of these physical and mental procedures of deliberation, which are arguably quite central to any sort of participatory democracy from indigenous groups, like the ones we talk about a bit in the book. You rather get the impression that the Enlightenment was this exclusively European thing with an exclusively European trajectory that goes back, through Elias to wherever, prehistory or something.
Yeah, your chapter 2
it's a
on
familiar
that
story.
influenced the reverse direction of European explorers learning from Native American intellectuals, or whatever the right word would be to describe them, and then taking those ideas back to Europe and incorporating them. I had not heard that before.
Yeah, which is a problem, because it's not a new idea. It's not something we dreamed up out of our heads. It's been around in the literature for a long time. It's actually what a lot of writers of the Enlightenment themselves said about where they were getting some of these ideas about freedom and equality. It's odd that it's still so controversial to suggest that European colonists who lived among Native American peoples, learnt their languages and vice versa, married and traded with them, that it's still such a heresy to claim that they actually learnt anything of moral or social value from them. But as we fully anticipated in the book, there is pushback against some of those ideas. And also there's, a certain amount of straw manning going on, and straw man arguments. Oh, you're saying Native Americans invented the Enlightenment. No, if you read the chapter, we're saying that there's a very particular set of encounters.
It's a great chapter. I learned a lot from that. I had never heard any of that. I knew Napoleon Chagnon pretty well, and he later regretted using the word the fierce people. As he pointed out, the Yanomamo, they're not fierce when they eat. They're not fierce when they make love. They're not fierce with their children. It's just this one little area. No, but let's go back to the Native Americans.
There's a joke that my co-author made that. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that.
No, he was saying that because apparently they sleep in proximity to each other, almost in bundles, and if they were as violent as they're sometimes made out to be, they'd all have killed each other for snoring a long time ago.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so the problem is the overgeneralization, the myth of the noble, peaceful Native American savages, okay, so that's debunked. Obviously, that's kind of a racist attitude. But neither were they, just as violent, let's say, as the Crusaders or something like that. So what do you do with, like, archaeological finds like that Pinker cites in the Better Angels of Our Nature, where, like, maybe 20% of the skeletons in a particular dig site show indications of violent death? And so it's only 20%. It's 1 out of 5. It's not like they all died violently, but yet the rates are much higher than they would be in a civilized state, something like that, as a percentage. So clearly there was some violence.
Think that's right, and the key to all these arguments is that you must try to resist the temptation to cherry pick. If this is what's been going on, in our opinion, on a very large scale, is cherry picking. If you're, let's say, a neo-Hobbesian, and you want to make the case that human societies were endemically violent until the origins of the state, you're going to have to ignore. Yeah, you can pull out Ötzi the Iceman with an arrow in his thigh, but that's not very good. That's one example for tens of thousands of years, right? You're going to have to ignore a huge amount of evidence. Equally, if you're a neo-Rousseau kind of person who wants to pretend that it was all lovely, hunky-dory, peaceful, you're also going to have to ignore a huge amount of information. Exactly as you say, there are periods of prehistory going all the way back to the Paleolithic. There have been rigorous quantitative studies of this. There is evidence of interpersonal violence and even warfare going back tens of thousands of years. Are you just going to ignore all of that? We certainly don't ignore it in the book. We're just as aware of that as we are of the fact that there's evidence for long periods of people apparently making peace. And, the idea that we're innately one thing or another can only really, we're innately peaceful or we're innately warlike. These days, in order to maintain a position like that, you've got to be a great big cherry picker. And that's what we're arguing against. What the evidence shows, if you look at it in as much of its totality as you can manage in the scope of one book, is that we were never one thing or another. If there is something distinctive about our species, it's that we've always had that capacity to choose collectively between those kinds of alternatives. In other words, we've always had the capacity to be moral beings and ethical beings and to weigh up those alternatives, much as Christopher Böhm points out. So that's our issue, if you like, with those rather selective ideas.
It's a fair point. And Pinker also makes the point that if you tally up the body count, how many people have governments killed? Their own people. It's hundreds of millions. Just not even counting wars, interstate wars. Just how many of their own citizens that governments have killed? It's massive.
Go against his own his own theory.
Yeah, it's a little more subtle than that. He's basically saying for the last several hundred years we've been figuring out social technologies to keep governments from killing their own people. And so in my favorite passage from the Federalist Papers from James Madison, he writes, "But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself." And therein lies the problem that we...
It's fascinating. Yeah. In that formulation, as far as I can tell, you've got men and you've got angels, but there are no women.
There's no women, yeah. So that's
maybe that's the problem with the theory.
Well, that is reflecting 18th century thought, of course. I remember in the late 80s, I read a book called The Chalice and the Blade. Do you remember this? Rianne Eisler. It was
someone else was bringing that up the other day, and I've never read it, I confess. So I'm going to rely on you, Michael.
Well, I haven't read it in a long time, but it's one of these kind of cherry picked, and it's in this old formulation but flipped. In this case, long ago in a civilization far, far away, humans lived in matriarchal societies that were much more egalitarian and fair and just and feminized. And then, the bad thing happened, the fall from grace, it's the Genesis story. And then the fall from grace and patriarchy. And now we got all this shit going on, but we got to get back to more feminized, again, it's kind of the oversimplified in the other direction.
Yeah. I mean, the closest you get to that in my field, actually it's something we go into in the book when we're writing about early farming societies, Neolithic societies, was the work of Maria Gimbutas, who's a Lithuanian-American prehistorian. She was the great expert of her day on Balkan prehistory and also an authority on Indo-European languages. And she's often accused of saying things not very different from what you've just said from is it Eisler?
Yeah, Riane Eisler.
Eisler book. Yeah. She's often talked about as having characterized Neolithic societies as matriarchal. She never actually did. There's a very good piece by the feminist author Charlene Spretnak, where she goes quite systematically through Gimbutas' work and what people have claimed about it, and shows that most of them clearly had never read it before they said that she said the. Some of our book reviews so far have claimed that we talk about Neolithic societies as matriarchal, which is just pretty bizarre. If you actually read our book, it's funny. I don't know why that happens. I guess whatever. Actually, what Gimbutas was talking about is very interesting. She was basically arguing that domestic structures in prehistoric societies in that particular part of the world, so Central Eastern Europe down to the Middle East, Anatolia, were not patriarchal, which immediately makes them different from many later Bronze Age civilizations that were highly patriarchal, as we know. They were different. Men and women seem to have lived in rather different spheres of life in the way that some of those Iroquoian societies we talk about in the book, women would have control of the agricultural sphere and the domestic realm. Men would have more to do with hunting and diplomacy and interacting with Europeans. So depending which way you look at it, it could be matriarchal and patriarchal all at the same time. It's just in different spheres of life. And what she was arguing was something a bit more on those lines, with women having priority in the ritual and the religious sphere, but not matriarchy, which is something else. And her work was really slaughtered. I mean, after she died in the 1990s, I think people regarded her as having got too close to New Age religion and some of the more wacky theories that you were talking about, touching on earlier. And nobody looked at it for a while, and now people are starting to look at it again. And the evidence is obviously much better these days. And I think it's important because otherwise, as you say, you're either back with the Garden of Eden, where you say there was a moment when women lost this primordial freedom and autonomy, became subservient to men. Or sometimes you get the opposite. You'll get evolutionary anthropologists, not very many, I have to say, but you occasionally come across the argument that patriarchy was there from day one. That's how it was sort of hardwired. And these are very politicized discussions. There are different strands of chauvinism and feminism that regarded as essential to get this right. I think, I mean, it falls back into that category of rather simplistic stories about the human past that don't really address much of the evidence. What's important about Gimbutas' work, though, is that she at least asked the question: what were these societies like before the first hard evidence of patriarchy? And she found something intriguingly different. We may not be able to define exactly what it was. She uses the term matristic or matrifocal, but it clearly wasn't that, which is important because then you can begin to ask another question, which is, how did patriarchy begin? How did that set in? If you can't even ask the question without being accused of, New Age fantasies, or being unscientific, then it's not very helpful if you're trying to understand how changes in the domestic sphere actually happened.
Well, maybe you would incorporate her work, and maybe even the examples that Riane Eisler provides in The Chalice and the Blade. I don't remember what they are now, but it's part of your diversity of different kinds of way that people live together.
Mm. That's right. That's right. I'm slightly conscious that it's time for me to begin winding up our conversation.
I was about to do that, actually, because I read your book before there were any reviews, because it wasn't even published yet. And so yesterday I went and read all the reviews, and I was amazed at these accusations that this was a modern political statement of anarchy.
Right. Isn't it extraordinary?
I did not get that from the book at all.
What? No. Thank you for saying that. I really appreciate it, actually, because I have to say I've also been a bit bewildered by some of it, particularly because I don't expect that of academics. I mean, actually, it's tenured professors at good universities who are shoving labels on this book, which are not our labels. And as I say, it's a bit of a doorstopper. It's got a very thorough bibliography. It's well referenced. It's disappointing. I don't really know how to respond to it except with disappointment, because it feels rather like they haven't read the book in good faith.
Yeah, well, the specific accusation is that your co-author David Graeber was one of the leaders of the Wall Street. I'm sorry, what is it? We're the 99% Occupy Wall Street.
That's neither accurate. That's neither accurate nor is it an accusation. I think he's very proud. Was very proud, rightly proud, of his role in that movement, which was specifically a movement without leaders. That was one of the whole points.
Right, and then,
but I don't see what that's got to do with the kind of reviews you're talking about.
The link that they're drawing is that he's an anarchist of some sort, and the point of your book is that there is no reason to think that central authority and government like we have is necessary. Therefore, we can have an anarchic-like state because look at all the examples from history. That's what they're saying.
But do they think that Jared Diamond and Steven Pinker come from Mars and Jupiter? I mean, we all live on this planet, and we've all got lives, and we've all got things that we do when we're not writing books. And of course, there's always a relationship between those things. But how often do you see a review of one of Yuval Harari's many books that begins with who he voted for in the last Israeli election? I've yet to read one.
Yeah,
might put things in a whole different light. I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't either. I know he meditates. I don't know what that means politically, but
okay, great. But you see what I'm driving at.
Oh, totally. So why do you think that angle comes up in multiple reviews?
I can't psychoanalyze my reviewers, Michael.
Yeah,
you're going to have to ask them that question.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll do that.
But I can respond to them. I'm in the business of respond. I can't possibly respond to all of them, but I am responding to one particular review at the moment. I won't tell you which, but it seemed sufficiently important to do so because it casts doubt on the variability of my discipline of archaeology to really tell us anything reliable about the human past, and it's a bit much.
To me, the encouraging thing about your book was how creative humans can be at coming up with new forms of governance, or whatever you want to call it, just getting along with each other. Because clearly the system we have, although it's much better than it was in the past, obviously we have still a lot of massive problems to solve, and maybe there's another way to do it that no one's thinking of. And the only way to think of new ideas is to know what people have tried in the past.
And also to establish that there's something to talk about in the first place. And I think this is, if there is a political message to our book, I would say that it's probably that, which is that we've been selling ourselves short. We've given ourselves what I'd call a kind of false prospectus of human possibilities, which shuts down certain kinds of conversations before they even get started. Just like that image you started with from, I think it was the Diamond book, that as the number of dyads and the scale of human societies grows, you're locked into a certain path of development. That's what we're questioning. We're not charting a route into the future. We're not dogmatic. We're not prescribing what you must do this and you must do that next. But we are saying that there are conversations to be had which are not taking place or which get poo-pooed before they even get off the ground because of other dogmas.
Yeah. Perfect place to end it, David.
Which don't stand up to scrutiny.
Yeah.
But that does seem like a good place to end.
Well, one of the reviewers mentioned before your co-author died that you guys had planned multiple volumes. So what else might you pursue along this line?
Yeah, we were going to write at least 3 more books.
Well, what are you going to do?
The important thing was that we were going to write them. We hadn't decided what would be in them. We just knew that we were having so much fun with all this. There are a couple of concepts in The Dawn of Everything. As you'll see, we don't just deconstruct the existing story. We also propose quite a number of new concepts. We talk about 3 basic forms of domination, 3 basic forms of freedom. We talk about how inequality works from below. All of these, as we say in the book, need more exemplification. We haven't even begun to explore the implications of some of these ideas. And we always thought of this not simply as something that the 2 of us would do, but hopefully as a stimulus for lots of other researchers to address these kinds of questions. And I hope that will still happen, even without
that should be your next book. What on freedom? What is freedom? What do you mean by freedom? That's a current hot topic.
Could be.